I mentioned moments ago the great Marc Thiessen, Washington Post columnist, former White House speechwriter, and Fox News contributor, was in the studio with us talking about this. Martha said that this group of lawmakers is a thorn in the side of Kevin McCarthy. Should he become Speaker through some sort of compromise arrangement, what kind of thorn in his side will they be if he tries to govern, or as he tries to govern?
He'd basically be sitting with a gun to his head the entire time if he took one step that they disagreed with, and then they could just end his speakership. So he'd be a hostage. Essentially. I mean, it's interesting. Martha made a really interesting point, which is that, if the red wave had arrived, this would never be happening. I mean, let's look at the election that brought us to this point for a second. So Joe Biden is the most unpopular president in the history of presidential polling, yet he put in the best first-term performance of any president in a midterm since John F. Kennedy, with the exception of George W. Bush after 9/11. Why is that? It's not because the Democrats are popular. It's because voters looked at the candidates that the Republicans put forward and said, no thanks. They rejected the Republicans. And it's the faction of the Republicans that they rejected that are now holding the House hostage. If we had a 30-vote majority and there had been a red wave, this wouldn't be happening today because they wouldn't need those five, now growing faction of votes. So the irony is that these people who are doing this are the faction of the Republican Party that was rejected by the voters in the poll, and now they're exercising this power that they only have because we have Republicans have such a small majority.
Yeah.
Mark, there was a big endorsement by former President Donald Trump for Kevin McCarthy prior to this vote. How would you describe the impact of that, Mark?
Negligible. I think Trump's influence of the Republican Party is becoming smaller and smaller, and he's a shrinking former president in terms of his influence within the GOP. But the question here is Trump is sort of a sideshow to this. The Republican Party has to move on beyond Trump, and they need to pick somebody who's going to lead the Republican Party in the House, because that's the majority we have into the future. This group. Their power has increased as a result of the weak performance in the election. They have the power, but their power is limited. They have the power to stop Kevin McCarthy from becoming Speaker if they hold their ground. They don't have the power to elect a Speaker of their own, because the majority of the House is more moderate, they're conservative, but they're not from this MAGA backward-looking faction, and so they're going to have to come up with a consensus candidate behind it. It's not going to be Jim Jordan. It's probably not going to be Byron Donalds, though who knows how much support he has among the moderates. But it's going to be somebody else that has the support. Maybe it could be Steve Scalise. Maybe Steve Scalise was just reelected as the majority leader with a broad support from both this faction and the moderates. It's got to be somebody who, and maybe Byron Donalds moves up in the leadership. He gets out of this and becomes the chairs move around in the leadership. But it's got if Kevin McCarthy can't put this away at some point, we're going to have to move on.
So. Perspective all depends on where you sit, or
Sure.
many times it does. So Andy Biggs just tweeted out, quote, Kevin is now 0-4. His opposition has grown in just 2 days. It's time for him to hang up the cleats and let the House move forward without him at the helm. Country over ego. Now, the people who are supporting McCarthy would say exactly the same thing to Biggs, that you're putting your ego over your country.
I agree with that. I mean, but here the reality is they have this power. And if they stand their ground, Kevin McCarthy's not going to be the Speaker. So at some point, he's either got to be able to move them and win them over, which it doesn't look like he's succeeding in doing, or at some point the party has to move on and open it up and find somebody else who's going to who can win the majority of the caucus. It's not going to be, these people are not going to pick the next Speaker. They can stop the McCarthy from winning it, but they're not going to be the ones who pick the next Speaker. They'll have a say in it, but it's got to be somebody who can appeal to this group and also to the broader majority of the Republican caucus.
So we're watching, if we turn our attention to the screen here, obviously Kevin McCarthy and these conversations that continue on the House floor, noting that in front of the chamber, GOP whip Rep-elect Tom Emmer is speaking at length with, who is going to be our guest shortly, Rep-elect Byron Donalds. So these conversations are happening right now, Mark, and we can all wonder what's taking place, what's being said, what trading is being done, and when a possible fifth Speaker vote would happen. Yesterday, the second vote they rolled right into the second vote. That may not be the case today.
Yeah, it may not. I mean, and look, Kevin McCarthy said the other day, "I've earned it." That's a fairly entitled statement. I mean, he is not entitled to the speakership of the House of Representatives. I don't know that he's earned it. The Republican Party put in the worst performance of any party in the minority since JFK. If he had won a 20 or 30 seat majority, then yeah, he could say he earned it. We're not. We don't have that. We have a very narrow majority, and so he's not entitled to the speakership. It's not about him. It's about advancing conservative ideas and getting the best speaker who can do that, who can bring the whole caucus together. So if he can't do that, then at some point he's going to have to step aside and make way for somebody else who can do that and who can bring all the factions together.
I've just been looking at all the responses and things on my Twitter feed, and Byron Donalds getting a lot of support from Republicans out there. Certainly, if Democrats take back the gavel in the House, they will make history with the first African-American speaker. Republicans get there ahead of them.
That is possible. I mean, first of all, we got to start. We started asking Byron Donalds about what some of his positions are on. There's a large majority of the House Republican caucus who supports continuing aid to Ukraine. He started out being very supportive of aid to Ukraine, but he, during the campaign, said that he was against it. So I want to know, and a lot of Republicans are going to want to know, where do you stand on the fight between tyranny and freedom in Ukraine? I don't think he can get elected speaker if he can't win over that majority if he's going to cut off aid.
Yeah, he's only been there for 2 years.
Yeah. So and exactly, we don't know where he stands on a lot of issues and where he'd lead this. So now it becomes the interesting. Because it starts getting interesting now if McCarthy can't lock this up, because you're going to have him. He's going to come forward. He's going to have to explain where he would lead the caucus. Other people are going to come forward maybe but everyone's waiting to see whether McCarthy is dead or not.
And then
it's April. Exactly.
We've been monitoring the White House. President Biden was speaking a short time ago to see what perhaps the White House is saying about all of this, seizing on the moment, as one of our producers is describing the situation on the GOP side of the House floor right now in disarray, Mark. So it's anybody's guess how this proceeds, what happens next, but this is obviously pretty engaged conversation that is happening with Kevin McCarthy right now. We're watching live on the House floor.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, what I worry about going forward is that if McCarthy were to succeed at this point, what we were talking about with John earlier is that he's got a gun to his head now. He's made so many concessions to this group that you're going to have a faction of about 5 of the most extreme Republicans in the House caucus who basically have veto power over anything that the House Republican caucus does. And so, has he given up so much? And would another speaker candidate who stepped in to replace him have to make those same concessions to get the job? Steve Scalise can say, okay, well, if you want me to be your leader, okay, but I'm not going to make all these concessions to you. We're going to have.
But I don't know that they'd want the concessions from Scalise. I don't know that they'd want any concessions from Jordan. I don't know that they'd want them from Donalds.
Yeah.
They don't trust Kevin McCarthy is the issue.
Maybe another candidate who can come, because you have to have rules in place that allow you to enforce discipline on the caucus. At some point, if this is the future of the next 2 years of the House, where everything we try to do is held hostage by a small band of people, then this is going to be the most chaotic and failed House majority in the history of the country, and we're going to lose the House majority in 2 years. I mean, if this is the model of the future for the next 2 years, we're in big trouble in the Republican Party.
All right, so we're just getting our latest note here from Chad Pergram, noting things are getting worse for McCarthy. 20 GOPers, obviously, as you can see on your screen there, voting against McCarthy and in favor of Byron Donalds. But GOP Rep Spartz voting present. That obviously was a big change from what we saw in the previous ballots. Heading into all of this today, there was some clue that Kevin McCarthy saw his path to victory here by more votes in the present category. There is one, but not enough. So, John, Marc Thiessen joining you there in D.C. Thank you very much to Mark, and our coverage will continue here.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.